question concerns DFID's strategy in Nigeria. DFID have been very explicit that their program in Nigeria is not about resource transfer. It's not a traditional aid program in terms of sort of directly digging wells or building schools. It's about enabling the Nigerian government to do better with its own resources. And I found it interesting what Dapo said about the metaphor of pockets reformers in an ocean of resistance. And I was just wondering what the panel thinks about whether DFID's strategy to kind of enlarge and strengthen these pockets of reformers, to what extent that is a wasted effort, because it's pushing against a tide that can't be turned, essentially.
Do you have anyone in particular you'd like to
address? Well, I mean, given that Hadiza is working on a DFID funded program, it might be difficult for her to answer, but particularly Dapo, I suppose, but anyone who's interested. And I should add that I'm just here I'm not here representing the committee, I'm just here of mine in accord.
Thank you. Can you do that one for us?
Oh, well, I thought it was Hadiza's domain. Well, I think we can share this. If you don't mind, sorry, what was your first name? Stephen. I'd actually look at it the other way. These reformers operate in a society. And even if they want to engineer reforms, they can't do it alone if they don't have civil society support. So you have a scenario whereby you can have the best plans, you can have integrity, you can really want to drive those changes. But if you face resistance within the vested interests, within government or within the private or in the business sector, the only source of form of support you have is actually civil society. So I would, in response to your question, say yes, you do need to strengthen those reformers. I mean, and I'm sure Hadiza will talk about this. I mean, my role in working for government, I was actually, while working at Ministry of National Planning, I was actually, as part of a technical assistance program, to support the minister to get the ministry working more effectively. That is one of those ways, for example. So you strengthen the capacity of the ministry, you bring more technical people who can help to do things with more technical rigor and be able to ensure that the right processes are followed and things of that nature. But if you are trying to reform and you're swimming against the tide, so to speak, the only other backup you have is actually having civil society, the citizens actually saying, these are reforms we want, these are reforms we need to do, this is someone who is driving it, we need to support him. And interestingly, politicians tend to listen to such. I think you might want to even give an example of Savvy, one of the programs that DFID runs, which actually deals with that.
Yes, Stephen, I have to say that first of all, I don't speak for DFID, but I have to say that DFID have been very instrumental and I would say experimental in actually trying reforms and going to deal with huge challenges which ordinarily other development partners would not do. And I think DFID started to sort of identify ways of doing this from the drivers of change documents and all those things going forward. Another thing that DFID has done quite well is understanding the political economy of every state or whether it's federal level and using that knowledge to inform whether it's individuals to strengthen in terms of reform champions or institutions that they identify as needing to be strengthened in order to sustain a lot of the reform efforts that have been gained. I have to tell you that a lot of the reforms that have been successful have done so based on having some form of either a political champion or an institution or a certain issue that was very pertinent to the governor or whoever was in power. I'll give you an example just coming from what Dapo has said. Spark works with another program which is called Savvy, which is the Voice and Accountability Program. In 2011, a particular state had a massively overbloated budget. And this budget was just before an election where, it was a very ridiculous budget. And the money for the budget was released in November, and by December, it had to be used up Now, for such amount of money, I mean, it was a bit ridiculous. And so Spark and Savvy sort of partnered together, better informed civil society, and that was able to improve awareness of what the issue were. And of course, the civil society approached government, and that sort of brought the expenditure down. Now, that was one thing we did which was a bit risky because, again, we almost got burnt doing that, both Spark and Savvy. But it did tell you that civil society, yes, are ready to take these things on, but they have to be better informed. The other thing is you have to make sure that you're sequencing support. If you don't do that, then you've got it out of place, and that doesn't really result in anything beneficial except cause further chaos in the system. So yes, DFID's strengthening of these individuals or institutions should continue, if only just to sustain the level of reforms that have been achieved so far.
On the bailout, first of all, so the DMO and this big bailout for the state is 500 something billion, whatever. That's phase one. Phase two, when CBN came in, there's a special causes facility. Now the DMO would have you believe that the CBN actually undid most of its good work, which I think is probably Patrick is suggesting probably. So you have this tight discipline, this is a reschedule of your debt, this is what you have to do, into bonds, whatever. So now, but then, but more money made available by the CPN on sort of maybe not the best possible grounds. So just a comment on the bailout. Question was about decentralization. So where you've got to now is, look, the cake is tiny as we know, and there's been the latest service costs are being deferred, whatever it is, 1 month, probably more. 1 month won't make any difference, several months probably. But looking further down the road, I mean, how about the decentralizing? Well, the ground would be that, okay, the state should know best what its police forces should be doing after all, which is a point of contention. So, rather than, Patrick saying it was a heavy hand or whatever it was for Hari to adopt with the state, the alternative would be you go the other way, of course. But I mean, is that feasible, or the state's not up to it? That's the question. And very finally, I noticed that there's a suggestion for Paul's next paper could be the same exercise on the local governments. Yeah, please.
All right. Well, is there anyone in particular you'd like to?
No, anybody.
Right.
Anybody.
Patrick, how would you like to?
Well, just on this issue, it's a vexed issue whether the state, governors already have a security vote, but whether they should control their own police forces. I have to say, I was reporting on the Rivers State election with a lady at the back of this room, and what we saw with the local INEC office was pretty surreal. That was because the guy, the politics of River State were that the outgoing governor, Rotimi Amechi, had, as I said earlier, foul of Good Luck Jonathan. And so they were determined that Newsom Wiki was going to be the next governor, and who just happened to be best friends with Patience Jonathan, the First Lady. And so they made pretty sure that election went that way. I mean, all manner of things were going on there. And I think now, and there was a court case, and Jonathan and Wike's opponent, took it to the tribunal. Is lost on several. I think Wike is going to be an incredibly difficult guy to get out of that position. Whatever happens now. The River State. You've got a budget of $2.5 billion a year. Okay, that was under the old oil price. It's probably going lower, but still, it's proportionally, it's up there with Lagos and Kano as one of the richest states in the federation. So I think, the governors have got quite a lot. I'd be a little chary about letting them have their own police force, quite frankly, because it's not like you get the assembly, for example. The state assemblies are not accountable. Say what you like about the National Assembly, and I'm sure you will. causes huge headaches for the president. But the state assembly tend to be sycophants to the governor usually. So you get a state assembly that's not holding the governor to account. You get a governor with, in some cases, $2.5 billion a year to spend, plus a police force, paramilitary force, whatever you like. I don't know where that would take democracy and accountability, but it strikes me it would risk taking it to not a very good place.
Thank you.
What I wanted to know, you said, Dapple, that you implied that necessity is the mother of invention in scenarios where people are forced to be more creative because funds are withheld. How are we going to get all these states in Nigeria that produce nothing to learn how to become productive? Because I have to tell you, I mean, the reason I mentioned my ethnic origins is because where I come from, there's an awful lot of frustration about the fact that 90% of the country produces little or nothing and lives off what comes out of our creek and our lands. I'm sorry if that sounds curmudgeonly, but that's how we feel.
Thank you very much for that question, Donu.
Sorry, from a more positive point of view, rather than just whinging on about everyone leeching off us, how can you genuinely persuade comatose states to actually rev up their IGR?
First of all, it's a pleasure to meet you in person. I listen to you quite often. I know your work, so it's nice to see you. I won't whinge. You've done it on my behalf. But I think there are times that the government has to learn from the people. And I think in many cases, the people, just for the basis of daily survival, have actually already shown the way. We only have to look at so many young people on the streets of Nigeria who don't even think about the existence of a government. But every single day they find something to do, they think of a different way, a different skill to develop, whether they're selling pure water or whether they're making baskets or whatever the case may be. People need to survive, and because they need to survive, they are being entrepreneurial. I don't think anybody will contest the fact when I say Nigerians are some of the most entrepreneurial people you will find. So I think to a great degree, if a government is able to sit down and look at what young people, particularly young people, are already doing, and latches onto that, you might find that, there is more scope than we actually imagine. And I'll give you an example. I was involved in the rebasement of the GDP of our country. And all along, we have been talking about diversification. We need to be looking at agriculture. But we never looked at the entertainment industry because we were like, well, that's just music and people dancing and, TV. But apparently, the entertainment industry had quietly, on its own, without government intervention, without government support, just been growing. Young people doing innovative things, training themselves how to act, making a movie in 2 days. Even Hollywood has a few things to learn from us. So that's a bit of an example of how, in many cases, sometimes it's not the states or the governors that will have the wisdom on what you do, but in many cases, the people actually lead the way, and there are times that governments have to learn from their people.
I just wanted to add on to what Dakwa said. First of all, I have to tell you, being a practitioner in the field, that there is no governor right now who is not trying to improve IGR. Money equals power. So, especially for states where, like you said, they don't have anything. Now, I think there's a fundamental point that we cannot overlook, which is the Constitution. A lot of the states which seemingly have nothing have some mineral resources. Exactly. But they are not constitutionally allowed to go off and start mining. However, Dakwa's old boss says they now can. But even at that level, some things need to be worked out in terms of who can do what and what extent is possible. You have the issue of agriculture. Everybody says, diversify and go to agriculture. It's all well and good. But when you look across the entire value chain, there are serious fundamental issues. And we have to recognize that a lot of these governors got to the state and met empty treasuries with a lot of debt. So you are just using the bailout, which of course there is a bailout and there is the front loading of the LNG funds, just to offset overheads. And even that is not enough. Of course, we have to understand also that a lot of money comes from payee, so this money is just being recycled. So I have to tell you, there's not one single governor that is not doing something and looking for something and traveling all around and having investment forums to try even, investment forums to bring in money. So they are looking at it critically. They are. I mean, I've been privileged to attend 1 or 2 Nigerian Governors Forum meetings, and that is topmost on the agenda. They're not just sitting and kicking their heels. The extent to which some people work at it is quite different. The extent to which donors will support those states, again, differs, because some states have 101 donors, others who actually have the appetite to want to reform these structures have none, because they are not in the right zone or they are not that important to partner with. So some of those things need to be put in perspective.
But Igbos have very few resources, and yet they're probably richer than everybody else.
Okay, but the
You see what I mean? I mean, it's to do with mindset.
But I tell you what, again, if you compare the IGR in a state, for instance, like Anambra, which has many markets, big markets, the IGR only just started growing, and that was my point about implementing IGR strategies where they can clearly see the big picture. Now, the current governor, Willie Obiano, came into power and decided that his vision was to industrialize the state. And so he went about, delivered his will of industrialization, and sort of made sure that things were put in place in the right way. And as I said, by just automating his tax systems, IGR shot up. And I've got some facts that I can share, because we've done extensive work in states regarding IGR. So I can share those with you. But don't think because they are resourceful, it amounts to improvement in IGR or richer states. It does not.
My question is in regards to the human resources aspect of this diversification process. I think that's a problem. That's an aspect that's often undermined, underlooked in terms of training and education. So I've traveled quite a bit. I've done work in a number of different countries, and I've observed the different level of emphasis different countries that have developed and are developing place on education. And I think when it comes to Nigeria, for example, I think it's a ticking time bomb in a sense with regards to young people. We've got a country full of young people. Many of them don't have access to quality education. In the last month or so, we've had 2 of the top 10 universities in Nigeria close down as a result of lack of electricity, for goodness sake, So whereas you compare that to something like China, they don't play with education, and as you can see, as the country develops, as the economy grows, you have indigenous people who are from the country, from those states, who are part of the process and who are in control of the resources and the development. I think in some countries on the continent, you find that although there might be economic growth, you might not necessarily see power handed over to citizens. It's more corporates, international, multinationals, etc., who are controlling wealth and stuff. So I think that's an aspect that's underlooked, and I think that's a key to proper, real diversification education.
Thank you. I think you put that very well. Does anyone want to add anything?
I think there's an important point. Obviously that's. I totally agree. It's got a major issue, and where it's relevant to this discussion, particularly, I think, are these screw-ups in education, and partly because the responsibility for education is so vague. Is it the local government, is it the state government, or is it the federal government? You used to be the state government, the local government's responsible. And I guess, while the governors tend to send their kids to private schools, they're not too bothered about what's going on in the state system, which is a problem we have in this country, funnily enough. But going back to Nigeria, it got so bad that the federal system then had to take charge of the education service in Nigeria to try and impose basic minimum standards and a national curriculum. But the message that education is as strategically important as having a decent army properly armed for the safety and the development of the country really doesn't seem to have got across. I mean, the number of statements one hears from leading figures in the government outside of election time, when everything is promised, like free secondary education, free tertiary education for all, you can count on the fingers of one hand. And I think it's really a real issue. And I think the comparison with China is spot on. People should be looking at what the Chinese have done with the quality of their technical education in particular. At the end of the day, I mean, it's pretty amazing that the governors don't seem to think that there's any mileage, political mileage even, in improving the schools. Again, what Kitty State was trying to do was to get, IT set up in more schools. And Kitty's got a pretty good record on this, because I think it's one of the, they're a bit like the Raleigh Triangle in North Carolina. They pride themselves on creating more PhDs in each state in the federation. But on a less elevated level, they've got a pretty good record on getting secondary and primary education up to snuff. And if they can do it, I can't see why every state in the federation can't. But it doesn't seem to have been given the priority that it's needed.
A very, very important question, especially with the youth bulge that is expected to just grow exponentially. I mean, you put it quite right. It's a ticking time bomb. And if it's not dealt with, then, we look at things that are happening with the cattle rustlers and the farmers, and you have the issues we're still dealing with Boko Haram. We have the rumblings of Biafra somewhere in the background. So this potentially could feed into any of those things. But I think when we talk about education, we should also sort of broaden out how we think about education, or how we talk about education, because I'm increasingly beginning to think that, on one hand, yes, there has to be basic education, numeracy skills, literacy skills, that kind of thing. And yes, there has to be space and the opportunity for people who can to go to, tertiary education. But vocational technical training is very, very important. And maybe because of issues of status or whatever the case may be, but if you look at the large numbers of young Nigerians who are probably too old to go back into a formal educational system or not, being able to train people to have technical skills, vocational skills that they can use to earn a living and contribute to their society, I think is absolutely fundamental. But then the other issue is, and this is something we perhaps haven't talked about, and I should be very careful how I say this, but one of the things we haven't talked about is if there's a clear vision or a development plan for the country. There are times we had Vision 2010. You alluded to needs, leads, and seeds earlier on. We had the Vision 2020. Now, none of these documents were perfect documents. They were hugely flawed. They had a lot of challenges. But at least you have a sort of sense of where the country was going. You had a sort of sense and some analysis of where the key sectors that could generate growth were. And we had a sense of where some of the human resource gaps were. So in that regard, the country could decide to actually pump money into training people in a particular area. But in the absence of a plan, then we're planning to fail.
Sorry, Paul. Can I just add that what we see at state level when we look at budgets is that ultimately the sectors that get higher monies is the infrastructure sector, and I think we know why. The sectors which get the least amount of money are health and education.